Hey, welcome to the channel. I'm your host, Jeff Smith. I sincerely appreciate you checking us out. I say that all the time, and trust me, I'm never saying it flippantly. I'm relatively new. I don't have many followers or subscribers. Every viewer and subscriber means a great deal to me. Truth is, if I had 1 million subscribers, all of them would mean a great deal to me. It just makes sense when you consider this ministry is all about God and others. That said, I pray you receive something from the Lord. I pray you receive some insight or at least a different and valuable perspective as a result of this ministry. The title of this message poses a question, as have many titles I've chosen in the past. You will find that to be my typical MO. I believe it serves to make the content of the message stick in your mind a bit more. Plus, sometimes I can't come up with another way of getting the point across. I entitled this message with the question, have you been to the street called straight? With that, I'll get on with it. I'm usually preaching to the choir when I speak. All of the messages I have presented have had a personal application. Hands down, this one goes to the heart of the matter with me because it arises from a personal experience in my past. You see, I believe God gave me the answer to several questions I once spent a great deal of time contemplating. Quite frankly, the reason I personally entertain those questions is because my relationship with Him was not where He desired. It's possible you have pondered over these same questions and maybe for the same reason. I pray this message will sufficiently answer them for you. For those of you who aren't aware, I was raised in a God-fearing, Bible-believing, and Bible-based home. Although I have not fought the good fight my entire life, I certainly know what that entails and what it looks like. Throughout my life, I have often wondered why it is in all of Christendom that some individuals steadily excel, sometimes even rapidly excel, while others ascend to higher heights more slowly, never achieving their full potential. Sometimes the latter group may even notice cessation of their forward progress. Sometimes they may even regress. I'm not suggesting the individuals who are content at living their lives on a spiritual plateau are not Christians, nor am I suggesting they won't make it to heaven. However, I do know that God opposes lukewarmness and mediocrity in our Christian walk. Such a bold assertion is undeniable when reading Revelation 3:16, which informs us that lukewarmness will result in the Lord vomiting us out of His mouth as the emetic-like waters of Laodicea. That topic of discussion is for another message. For the purpose of this message, I am merely pointing out the differences that exist between these two groups of people. We all encounter various challenges, trials, and tribulations in our Christian walk. Why are successful Christians' trials and tribulations more gracefully endured? Why are the errors of their way considerably less noticeable and typically not for public consumption? Most of us have witnessed the mockery that has been made of some well-known televangelists. Why do strong Christians seem to have shorter dry spells? Why do they typically demonstrate a perpetual ascension in their Christian walk while others have a propensity for life on the plateau or even a downward slope? What transpired in their lives that generated such a profound difference in their relationship with God that they never turned back? What is the key to their success? I recall a time in my distant past after I made a colossal mistake for which I harbored considerable regret and shame that I asked the Lord very similar questions. Due to frustration and disappointment in myself, I cried out to Him, my fist tightly clenched, ready to pound the kitchen counter adjacent to where I stood, my chin quivering and voice cracking while I unsuccessfully struggled to fight back the tears and to make my voice heard, I said, Jesus, you know my heart. You know the desire I have to do right by you and to do what you desire and have planned for me. I know you have something for me to do. Why can't I remain steadfast in your will instead of responding like a yo-yo to my convictions and resembling a roller coaster in my walk? Why can't I remain close to you like other Christians? Why am I intermittently distracted? Why do I keep blowing it? Out of nowhere, a statement entered my mind. This was it. Until you become blind, you will not see. For a moment, I just stood there. I didn't hear God audibly, but I was confident what came to my mind was from Him because, like I said, it came out of nowhere. In addition, it was incredibly random and didn't make any sense at all. It was obvious I didn't come up with it. Frankly, it didn't seem helpful at all. Initially, that is. Suddenly, the Apostle Paul's life came to mind. It was as if my questions were no longer banging off the ceiling. It seemed I wasn't participating in my own internal dialogue. It was as if someone snuck in. That may sound weird. Don't read more into it. Truth is, I believe God was gently answering my questions by way of that statement. For a moment, let's consider Paul's beginning. At that time, he was called Saul, but for the sake of avoiding any confusion, I will refer to him as Paul. After all, that is the name by which most Christians most commonly refer to him. Paul was a Hebrew among Hebrews. With regards to the law, he was a Pharisee. He was a brilliant man who possessed a firm grasp of the beliefs of that sect. He was extremely logical. If you have not spent much time reading the books he has authored, I highly recommend it. He was amazing. But prior to his encounter with the Lord, look what he did. Allow me to read Acts 8, 1 through 3. It reads, Now Saul heartily approved of putting Stephen to death. That day a severe persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and everyone except for the apostles was scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria. Devout men buried Stephen as they mourned loudly for him. But Saul kept trying to destroy the church. Going into one house after another, he began dragging off men and women and throwing them in prison. We see from these verses that such was the hatred Paul had for Christ and his followers that he delighted in their murder. So skewed was his perspective and zeal that he thought a Christian's death was appropriate retribution for their beliefs. He thought he was paying rightful service to God. Paul aggressively persecuted the church regardless of a person's gender. His name was voiced abroad, and many Christians feared him to the point of changing their residence. What ultimately served to change him into the man many have grown to admire? The account is documented in Acts chapter 9. For the sake of time, allow me to summarize what happened. Paul, by his own request, received letters from the high priest to go to the synagogues in Damascus. He was to bring back to Jerusalem in shackles those who believed in like manner to Stephen. Essentially, that was all Christians. While en route, a blinding light shone round about him and his comrades. He heard a voice calling him by name and saying, "Why do you persecute me?" Paul questioned who was speaking to him. Jesus identified himself as the one he had been persecuting. He then proceeded to tell him to continue on to Damascus and await further instructions. After Jesus finished speaking, Paul's companions had to lead him by the hand because when he opened his eyes, he was blind. Paul followed the instructions and remained without sight for 3 days in Damascus. During that period, he prayed. Now, I'm only speculating, but I believe he probably prayed like he had never prayed before. Clearly, he had no control over the situation. It seemed logical that in such a powerless state, it would be advantageous for him to follow the instructions the Lord provided to the letter if he had any hope of regaining his vision. During that time, the Lord spoke in a vision to a man by the name of Ananias. He told him to go to the street called Straight and to inquire about Paul. Upon finding him, he was to lay his hands on him and pray for him to receive his sight. Incidentally, Paul was seeing that same thing in a vision. Now, Ananias wasn't real comfortable with the whole idea because he knew Paul's history with the church. However, he did as he was instructed. Ultimately, Paul regained his sight, received the Holy Spirit, got baptized, and remained there for some time, preaching in the very synagogues where he was going to shackle people for doing the same. His life after that event turned around 180 degrees. He had become what he formerly persecuted. What happened? You see, when I asked the Lord the questions I previously discussed, I wasn't thinking about some major life lesson I could find in the scriptures. I didn't even consider the direction and example that might be gleaned from the life of a biblical character or author of several books of the Bible. I was frustrated with my lack of commitment to God, and I was desperate to make right my mediocre, at best, semblance of Christianity. The phrase, "until you become blind, you will not see," hit me with as much conviction as if God spoke to me audibly. The answer to all my questions arrived. The thoughts that were whirling around in my mind stopped immediately. It was like the light went on when I began considering Paul's life. What was the meaning of the phrase, "until you become blind, you will not see"? We understand Paul literally lost his sight. Upon regaining it, his life was radically transformed forever. He didn't return to his former lifestyle. His life and direction became all about Jesus Christ and Him crucified, buried, and resurrected. Before the transformation, his zeal was demonstrated by his willingness to murder for the sake of His cause. After the transformation, it was shown by his willingness to die for the sake of Christ. What does this mean for you and me? Do we all have to become physically blind before we can recognize our destiny and achieve our full potential in the Lord? For some, it may take that. It did for Paul. I believe the definition of blindness is very unique and tailor-made to suit each individual and their respective idiosyncrasies. It may mean some catastrophic event blinds you to the manner in which you are living and thus turns your life around. It may mean you become blind to your former way of thinking or to the doctrines you once held so near and dear. Whatever the case may be, if we ever want to reach our full potential in Christ, we must, in some manner and in some capacity, become blinded in order for us to ultimately regain visual acuity on the street called Straight. I find it very interesting that the name of the street is even mentioned. What happened to Paul is extraordinary without knowing it occurred on Straight Street. Have you ever wondered if God inspired the writer of Acts to put it there for a reason? I happen to think He did. There is some incredible symbolism here. Maybe you never even considered the name of the street. Well, my mind takes trips like that. That's just where my head goes. I ask you to peek into my mind and way of thinking. You'll be okay, I assure you. You might find it interesting. You see, Paul was physically blinded. Where did he regain visual acuity? Where was he when the scales fell from his eyes? Where the opacity of an obsolete doctrine or covenant was lifted? Where was he when he realized his destiny and when he gained mental insight and the knowledge of the truth of Jesus Christ? It was on the street called Straight. When you think of something being straight, you think of how it isn't crooked. You think of it as being level or true. You may even think of it as being the shortest distance between 2 points or one's destination. Paul was formerly delusional in his thinking when he entertained the idea of being right on track. He thought he was all that. His life was all together. The fact is, he was a half a bubble or so off. Now, my construction buddies understand what I mean when I say he was half a bubble off. They use levels of different varieties, probably on a daily basis. What I'm saying is that Paul wasn't on the right course. He wasn't level. He wasn't true until he went to the street called straight. It was there everything fell into place. His entire perspective was rearranged. He no longer embraced with unwavering commitment the belief system he had been taught from his youth that was further supported by way of his rather extensive and superior education and maintained until just moments before his dramatic conversion. His purpose was revealed, his ministry identified, and his efficacy ignited as a result of his unplanned and unparalleled trip to an otherwise common street called straight. We know this to be the case with him because all of Christendom is largely based upon Pauline gospel. Most are confident Paul authored at least 13 of the 27 books of the New Testament. Now consider Peter. For him, blindness and locating the street called straight was an entirely different process. He followed after Christ. He was one of the original 12 disciples. However, when Jesus was captured, I believe Peter began to question things. He became disillusioned. It's possible he entertained the question, how could the Messiah, the Savior of the world, be captured by mere mortals? The inspiration, motivation, faith, and it must be said, loyalty, which formerly defined him and served as the impetus behind his decision to follow Christ daily, were replaced by doubt and fear. So strong were those thoughts and emotions that he denied Christ on 3 separate occasions. Fortunately, the story didn't end there. Peter was likely consumed by guilt and shame after his multiple acts of denial. Who could blame him? According to our way of thinking, we probably would have ostracized him for betraying us just once. Imagine 3 times. It's quite possible we wouldn't have considered his feelings of shame and regret at all. Here's where the story gets good. Allow me to read Mark 16, 1 through 7. It reads, "When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices to go and anoint Jesus. Very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had just come up, they were going to the tomb. They kept saying to one another, 'Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?' Then they looked up and saw that the stone had been rolled away. It was a very large stone. As they went into the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were utterly astonished. But he told them, 'Stop being astonished. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look at the place where they laid him. But go and tell his disciples, especially Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you.'" In verse 7, we see the account of what I believe to be an angel telling the 3 women to go and inform Jesus' disciples and Peter that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Here's what I find astonishing. Peter is no doubt feeling like a total loser and outsider. Undoubtedly, he sounded like we do when we, in unrelenting fashion, kick ourselves in the posterior for our faults, failures, and shortcomings. You can almost hear him say, "How does one break past the barriers my obvious character flaw of disloyalty has created between me, my friends, and most importantly, my Lord?" Clearly, God knew in great detail the barrage of negative thoughts that inhabited Peter's mind. He knew with certainty the helplessness, hopelessness, and despair they would inspire. What did God do? He had the three ladies, under the direction of the messenger, single Peter out from the rest of the disciples. Why? I believe God wanted to acknowledge that he forgave, accepted, and loved Peter. He wanted him to know he understood him. God knew exactly what Peter needed. Tell the disciples, especially Peter. At that moment, a metamorphosis occurred. Peter became a new man. Why? I believe he was blinded by the love, grace, and mercy God so readily demonstrated to him, despite his betrayal of Jesus on 3 separate occasions. When his eyes were opened, you could say he found himself transported to Straight Street. Shortly after Peter heard how he was singled out, shortly after the scales were lifted from his eyes, so to speak, shortly after gaining his newfound visual acuity and realizing the magnitude and capacity of God's great love and forgiveness, shortly after he followed Jesus' instructions to wait in Jerusalem until they were endued with power from on high, he began to speak with newly acquired boldness and wisdom. He had more zeal and determination than ever before. His life was all about Jesus Christ and him crucified, buried, and resurrected. After Peter was baptized in the Holy Spirit, he began to boldly, powerfully, and eloquently explain and proclaim what spectators were witnessing on that day of Pentecost and what the crucifixion of Jesus, of which they were a part, had produced. You may recall how he confidently and fearlessly stated, "Let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God hath made that same Jesus who you crucified, both Lord and Christ." Later in his life, he wrote 2 epistles. Never again did he deny or betray Jesus. In fact, history tells us when he stood in the arena to be crucified for his belief in Jesus, he pleaded with the Romans to be crucified upside down because he did not consider himself as worthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. You might question how blindness was defined in my life. For me, it meant that I had to become blind to those things that held me back, that posed an obstacle to the perpetual move of God's Spirit in my life. I had to cease rationalizing their presence in my life as I had done for so many years. I knew they were inhibiting me from moving forward in my relationship with the Lord. I couldn't practice them in faith. I had to stop making excuses. I had to pray and make a concerted effort to no longer entertain them or consider their practice in my life. I had to become blind to them because if I could not see them, they would no longer possess the ability to distract me. When this occurred, I got on the right path. I got on the street called straight. My dad is the finest man of God I've had the pleasure of knowing on a personal level. I've always said if I turn out to be half the man he is, I'll be doing well. I have never heard him curse, lie, or wish any ill will towards another individual. He demonstrates more godly love than anyone I have ever met. He takes full advantage of every opportunity to witness to people because his steps are ordered by God. Now, I'm not giving these accolades to puff him up or exalt him. You'll never hear me, or him for that matter, ever deny the source of his success. What I'm doing is showing that a higher road, a straighter street, exists. Once found, it makes all the difference in the world. After Jesus revealed this to me, I asked my dad if there was a point in his Christian walk where he became blinded and then determined within himself that nothing would halt his forward progress. I thought that it might have been the time when he and my mom were not serving the Lord and my brother woke up hysterically from a dream or nightmare as it was. My dad had to gently pat his face to calm him down and bring him around. The dream was that intense and surreal. When my dad and mom could finally get my brother to speak, he told them that in his dream, he was taken to heaven and they were left behind. But that was not the incident that blinded my dad. I also considered that it might have been my birth that opened his eyes and inspired him to take his first steps on the street called straight. You see, I was a breech presentation. I came out backside first, which certainly explains a whole lot about me. The OB/GYN who was orchestrating my delivery was an older gentleman who had a long history in his field. Regardless, he was having trouble. The nurse kept asking him if he wanted her to get someone to help because I wasn't making my entry into this world without a fight. My mom was experiencing anxiety on a level far greater than normally experienced during the delivery of a baby. She heard the Lord speak to her audibly. He said, "Why don't you call on me?" She said, "Jesus," and out I came. Later, the OB/GYN told my mom he considered giving up his practice because of the difficulty he encountered during my delivery. That was before Jesus intervened. These two events served to awaken my parents to the need for salvation. They began pondering over how to get their hearts right with God. Unfortunately, my mom is no longer with us, so I never had the opportunity to ask what blinded her and set her feet on the street called straight. For my dad, it wasn't these two life-altering events. They served a purpose in getting them back with God, but it wasn't until he became blind to the doctrine which he believed from his youth that landed him on that street. To hear him tell it, that's one of the primary reasons he is on Straight Street today. Have you been blinded? Has something occurred in your life that triggered a spiritual quickening? When your sight was restored, did the street sign your eyes beheld display the name Straight? You see, I could have easily made the focus of this message about being blinded. I could have entitled the message, "Have you been blinded?" I could have left it at that. But God didn't end it there for me, and I would be remiss if I ended it there for you. Getting to the street called straight is of utmost importance in your Christian walk. I believe God allows certain things to occur in our lives to get us back on course or to get us to Straight Street. I also believe these things occur to bring about the necessary alterations in our character that will ultimately serve to aid us in achieving our full potential. I'm not suggesting the Lord tempts us, because God cannot be tempted, neither does he tempt anyone. I'm not suggesting bad things happen to us because God creates bad things for us. What I am suggesting is that he chastens or disciplines those he loves. What I am suggesting is that he allows things to proceed naturally where he may have otherwise prohibited them. When these kinds of events occur, they can prove blinding. The important thing to recognize, however, is the fact that the end result is of far greater significance than the means by which you achieved it. In other words, that blinding event means absolutely nothing if the end result is not your arrival on Straight Street. If you do not submit to the design and purpose for which God allowed the event to occur, its occurrence is in vain. We have been created with the right to choose. We have a choice in most everything we do, and with regards to how we respond to most everything that comes our way. After being blinded and regaining sight on Straight Street, Paul could have decided to take an alternate route on his life's journey. Peter, after being blinded by God's love, grace, and mercy, could have chosen to live the remainder of his life with doubt, fear, shame, and regret as his driving force. He could have chosen to talk a different talk and walk a different walk. I could choose to practice those things that inhibit the move of God's Spirit in my life as opposed to being blinded to them. My dad could remain a fierce proponent and a dedicated follower of those doctrines to which he formerly used to cling, all the while never fully understanding who Jesus Christ really is. We all have a choice. Every prominent Christian figure I know or have read about has been blinded at one point in their lives or another. But they didn't let it stop there. When their eyes were opened, they realized they had been miraculously transported, if you will, to Straight Street. That is where their new and more productive life began. And the degree of their future success can be measured by their ability to remain there. I suppose you could say a direct correlation exists between your continued success and your perpetual residence on Straight Street. I don't know where you are spiritually. For some, this message may prove only marginally inspirational. For others, it may be the exact recipe needed to get you out of the rut that has prompted you to remain spiritually stationary or stagnant. It may be what's needed to rescue you from mediocrity. It may be what is needed to blind you from your former tendency of rationalizing that life on the plateau is perfectly fine. It may be what is needed for you to get on Straight Street where you can really taste and see that the Lord is good. God desires to use you in ways unimaginable. He didn't instill special gifts and talents within you to go untapped. I don't know any Christian out there who doesn't want to hear the words, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." The Lord can't and won't say that to you or me if we let our talents go to waste. We won't hear those words if we are like the foolish servant who buried his talent in the earth. Because of God's great love for us, He allows things to occur in our lives to blind us in order to wake us up. Once that spiritual quickening occurs, His greatest desire is that we remain on Straight Street. That's where we will be nearer to Him. That's where we will appreciate a heightened understanding of Him. That is where direction and the skills acquired to better wield our gifts for His good purpose and pleasure, glory and honor are found. If you're not where you want to be in relation to Jesus Christ, if your Christian walk can be likened to a yo-yo like mine was in the past, I encourage you to submit to Him and then ask Him to move in a mighty way in your life. Pray that He does whatever it takes to set your feet on a firm foundation, to get you to level ground, to get you to Straight Street. That's where the excitement begins, and the pleasures of a closer relationship with Him await you. It's there that you resist the urges of conformity to this world, and that the fires of transformation are ignited or are fanned by the renewing of your mind. It's there you begin a perpetual journey in accordance with the Spirit and not the flesh. Have you been to the street called Straight? If not, I encourage you to seek the Lord for direction to it. You won't regret it. I haven't. God bless you. Have a great week. Thank you for joining us on For the Sake of the Call. We sincerely hope and pray this and every episode is a blessing to you. At the very least, we hope and pray you find it thought-provoking. We consider it an honor to serve our Lord by serving you. If you found something of value with this episode, we ask that you comment, hit the like button, and subscribe. We also ask that you click the notification button so you can be informed of upcoming episodes. If you would like to contact us, please see the link in the description below. May God richly bless you, and may your relationship with Him grow each and every day.